in here, but welcome. We're excited. We're supposed to have a really hefty crowd tonight for this lecture. So this is the fourth of this brand new lecture series that Case Western Reserve University Sequel Lifelong Learning Program, the Cleveland History Center, and the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland have started about Cleveland civics and Cleveland history. And participation has just been so resounding, and it's so exciting to see how excited everybody is to learn more about Cleveland history and our civics and the people who made Cleveland what it is. So we're going to be continuing this series now into the future. So it's a really great thing. Thank you all for your participation and for your enthusiasm for this brand new lecture series. So my name is Karen Lawrence. I am the Assistant Director of Case Western Reserve University Sequel Lifelong Learning Program. And so before we start the lecture proper, I just wanted to welcome everybody and just to sort of let you know how the lecture is going to proceed. I'm going to introduce Einav here in just a second, and then she's going to share her screen and start the presentation. This is a webinar, and so you can see and hear her, but she will not be able to see and hear you. But we still want your participation. We want to hear all of your questions, that sort of thing. And so you can participate in two ways. There's a chat button down below that you can click and type in your questions that way, or any comments that you have, any thoughts that you have throughout the presentation. And then there's also a Q&A button, and you can type your questions in there. And then I'll be reading through those, and we'll volley those questions to Einav at the end of the lecture. So it is one of the things that I appreciate about Zoom. I appreciate so much about Zoom that otherwise we would all be at home watching TV tonight rather than being able to do something as dynamic as this. But it's also really nice that you don't have to wait until the end of a lecture to ask your questions, that you can type them in as we go. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Einav. Einav Rabinovitch-Fox is a visiting instructor in the history department here at Case Western Reserve University, and she specializes in modern American history and women's and gender history. She examines the connections between culture, politics, and modernity, and is interested in the ways that visual and material culture has shaped and reflected class, gender, and racial identities. She's done work supported by Duke University, Smith College, the Schlesinger Library, and at Harvard, Winchester Museum and Library in Delaware, New York University, and she was also the Wade Postdoctoral Fellow at the Cleveland History Center, where she researched the cultural history of Gilded Age Cleveland, emphasizing on the Wade family, which I'm sure she's going to be talking about some of that research here tonight. And she is currently working on a book. Her book project is called Dressed for Freedom, American Feminism and the Politics of Women's Fashion, which explores women's political uses of clothing and appearance as a means of negotiating their new freedoms and modern gender identities. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Einav and take it away. Thank you so much for doing this evening.
Thank you, and thank you, Karen, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for the Seagull program and the Western Reserve Historical Society and the League of Women's Voters and everybody who, as Karen said, came here instead of just watching TV in this very cold night. So I look forward for your questions and commentary. I'll just share my screen so we can actually start. So I hope you all see me well. Great. So my talk today, as the title implies, will look at the philanthropic efforts of Cleveland women during the late 19th and early 20th century. And when we think of philanthropy, we often think about money, about big foundations, about names on walls and buildings. And these are important markers not only of the people who actually donated the money, but also of their values and their worldviews. And when we often think about philanthropy, we think about names such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, names that connected to money and to men. In Cleveland, it's names like Wade and Mather that comes to mind when we think about philanthropy. But more often than not, the image that we have is the one that you see here of white, often old men. When we think about women, if we think about them at all, they are often in the background of the story. We don't hear about big philanthropists in the late 19th century who were women. However, what I want to suggest tonight is to look at other forms and ways of giving. The moneyed women of Cleveland, some had their own financial resources, some had access to them through their families, offered a different model of philanthropy that went beyond money and recognition. Focusing on the women of the Wade family, Ellen Garretson Wade and Alice Wade Everett, but not only on them, also on their social circle and milieu. I want to show how by taking an active role in promoting their own family status and forming meaningful partnership with their male spouses, they managed to carve themselves a realm of influence while also shaping the meaning of philanthropy at large. So Cleveland in the late 19th century was and that's often a period that we call it the Gilded Age, experienced really a period of prosperity and growth, and you can see it here. During this time, its population nearly doubled, making it the fifth largest city in the United States. The city's location at the center of trade routes attracted not only immigrant and cheap labor force, but also entrepreneurs that explored the emerging industries of coal and iron. By the 1860s, the city became a center for iron ore and oil refining and mining business, aided by the development of railroads and shipping transportation. By 1890, iron producers and oil refiners both boasted a $10 million industries, second only to those of New York. As a manufacturing as well as financial center, Cleveland attracted some of the nation's richest people who set their residencies at Euclid Avenue, which became the city's premier real estate location, receiving the name Millionaires Row. Names like Rockefeller, Hay, Mather, Wade, and Hanna occupy this opulent avenue, which unfortunately not a lot of the buildings remain from that, displaying their wealth through their luxurious mansions and their leisurely lifestyle. Some of these mansions did survive, so the next time you are driving through Euclid, try to look for them. Yet, unlike more established Eastern financial capitals like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, Cleveland elite was characterized by affluence, not by aristocratic origins. So there's no one there was on the Mayflower. There's not really kind of like old connections to the Revolutionary era. Most of the residents of Euclid Avenue were nouveau riche, self-made men who made their fortune in business and finance, and who were unbound by generations of molded traditions. For example, Jephthah H. Wade Sr., the patriarch of the Wade family, came from a family of modest origins from Seneca County, New York. He was the youngest of 9 children and began working at the age of 12 as an apprentice to a shoemaker. He rose into wealth after moving into the telegraph business, helping to found Western Union that we all know, which was a consolidation of a few telegraph lines. And in fact, private enterprise like Western Union was the cheap occupation for Cleveland men who concentrated on manufacturing, commerce, law, and banking. And this absence of both an urban legacy in Cleveland and an established old money elite shaped the nature of the city's social and economic development in the late 19th century, as well as its culture. And wealthy Clevelanders created a more unified, familial, and intimate culture than the one that we see in cities like New York or Philadelphia. These was based on friendship, intermarriage, and social affair that was less based on grandiose and decorum, but more about social relationship. Indeed, family life was at the center of Cleveland elite culture, and many tended to marry within the neighborhood's local circles. So for example, Alice Wade that you see here on the right married her next door neighbor, Sylvester T. Everett, in 1879, while her brother, Jephthah Homer Wade II, who knows as Homer, married Ellen Garretson, who was a childhood friend and a school companion a year earlier. The Stone sisters, another very prominent family in Cleveland, Clara and Flora, also married locally. Clara married John Hay, a family and a neighborhood friend, and Flora married her social peer, Samuel Mather, also a Cleveland native, and you can see her on the left on her wedding day. So while love and courtship were the main force behind these marriages, they nonetheless bonded families, fortunes, and business interests together, forging not only romantic partnership, but also material ones. A choice of a spouse, whether self-chosen or through a parental match, was not only based on mutual affection, but also on consideration regarding the family's social and financial status. This was the case of Alice Wade, for example, whose lawyer husband was crucial to the family's business. All this gave women a relatively comfortable position from which to claim and gain positions of power, as well as a say in their family's dealings. Moreover, in cases like the Stone family, absence of male heirs opened a way for women to gain access both to fortune and power unavailable otherwise. The Wade family also included a strong female presence as both matriarchs of the family, Ellen Wade's mother and Jephthah Homer Wade's mother, shared residence with the family heir. And for all of you, you know, dealing with your wife, your mother, and your mother-in-law in the same house, as big as it is, while running a business empire, you need a lot of skills for that. So, you know, it is a family business in many ways. Cleveland elite, like many of their peers in other cities, saw their role as a serving elite, kind of like following this ideas of noblesse oblige. And many were very much influenced by the ideas of civic stewardships that Andrew Carnegie described in his Gospel of Wealth. According to Carnegie, the main responsibility of philanthropy of the new upper middle class was to invest their surplus profit in communal projects that will help those who will help themselves. He argued that the best means of benefiting the community, is to place within its reach the ladders upon the aspiring can rise: parks and means of recreation, works of art, and public institutions of various kind, which will improve the general conditions of the people. While men often translated these ideas into monetary contribution and the founding of cultural institutions, women tended to contribute their time as their main resources, emphasizing the charitable aspects of their character and their domestic roles. In fact, it was often their responsibilities in the domestic realm as housewife and as mothers that women used as a way to extend claim for influence in the public sphere and were the base of their own philanthropy. And if the ideas of the gospel of wealth were those which propel the philanthropy of men, for women it was mainly their Christian faith and upbringing that was at the base of their activities. Flora Stonemathers, for example, attribute her philanthropic activities to her religious faith, explaining her motivation for her work by saying, "I feel so strongly that I am one of God's stewards. Large means without effort of mine have been put into my hands, and I must use them as I know my Heavenly Father would have me." Indeed, church and religion offer women a venue to engage in charitable work, serving both as a spiritual and communal center. First Presbyterian Old Church, certainly located at Public Square, attracted many of these city wealthiest residents and became an important center for philanthropic and social activities. Although the leadership of Protestant churches was male, women were active participants in the church charitable activities, which allowed them to move beyond the world of home and family, but still not to challenge those roles. In the case of Flora Stonemathers, her experience in the church led her to seek other social reforms. In 1867, she and her sister Clara joined the newly formed Young Ladies Mission Society, who did missionary work in the working class neighborhood just north of the church. As part of the society activities, Flora and her colleagues raised funds for the church mission, sewed garments for the poor, and held Sunday festivals. This missionary spirit also pushed Flora to found in 1896 Goodridge Settlement House, named after her admired reverend, in order to provide a center for such activities that are commonly associated with Christian social settlement work. And by the late 19th century, settlement houses were a common sight in the urban centers of the US. Influenced by progressive ideas regarding social betterment and the helping the poor, the settlement movement sought to eliminate social ills not just through material charity, but through education and community work that was supposed not to just to take care of the poor, but to solve poverty altogether. Led by wealthy women like Mather, the settlement house movement offered a different model of philanthropic work and service to the community. The major purpose of settlement houses was to help to assimilate and ease the transition of immigrants into the labor force by teaching them middle-class American values. Chicago, who was housed to the first settlement house, Hull House, and Jane Addams, who founded it, became the most famous settlement house in America, but there was definitely one in almost every city. And there they helped to educate immigrants by providing them class in history, art, and literature. Hull House also provided social services to reduce the effect of poverty, including a daycare center, homeless shelter, public kitchen, and public bath. And while it was usually young women like Addams who were starting those settlement houses, the case of Cleveland is a bit different. Flora, who was 44 and a mother of 4 at the time, did not live at Goodridge House. She maintained her residency at Euclid Avenue, but she was kind of like the main force behind Goodridge House. And although the work that was done at Goodridge resembled much of the work that was done in other settlement houses, it had lecture and classes, it had a gymnasium, a bowling alley, public bath, laundry, and several clubs. Flora's involvement was kind of a combination between a more traditional and masculine financial support and volunteer work. She served on the board of trustees and provided funds both for the settlement land and the building, as well as $10,000 for the first installment of an endowment fund. And it was a lot of money back then. She also covered the operating expenses of the house, but she's also contributed in ways that were not financial. She was fully engaged in its day-to-day activities, often worked with the children there, reading them books, changing diapers. And really her charitable activities and her work with children and mother was a way for her to enhance, in a way, her own motherhood. She was also a champion of girls' education, helping to found and fund Hathaway Brown, which is the school that her daughters went to. Again, thinking that you need to promote this sort of things because that's what women need to do. And if Goodridge House became a personal project for Flora Mather, for the Wade women, it was the Cleveland Protestant Orphan Asylum, who is now known as Beechburg. The Wade's involvement in the asylum began in 1875 when Jephthah Homer Wade Sr. Joined as a trustee and gave the building on St. Clair Street as a gift, as a purpose-built home for the orphans. Seeing the asylum as the holiest of all human charities, the Wade family commitment included both financial support in the form of a real estate and large sums of money, sometimes going up to $110,000 per year, as well as taking part in the day-to-day activities and administration. It was the women of the family, and particularly Anna McGaw Wade and her daughter, Alice Wade Everett, who played an active role on the board. Alice was part of the clothing committee that was responsible for all the clothing donation of the asylum's children. And Anna was part of the admitting and placing children committee that oversaw the orphans, that the orphans will still receive a deserving home after they left the institution. Ellen Wade and her mother were also very much engaged with the everyday life of the asylum children, providing both monetary and material contributions, especially around holidays. Unlike the men, the women of the Wade family sought not only to better the life of the asylum orphans, but viewed their activity in the asylum as an educational family project in which both the adults and the younger generation practice philanthropy. Assuming their roles as educators, charity workers, and agents of reform, these women extended their familial roles as mothers to broader circles of influence. And they really, for them, having a connection with the children was what that mattered. And you can see here from a list of donation for the 1896 Christmas donation list, really reveals the familiarity that the Wade women had with the recipients of their donations and how they view their role as philanthropists. In that year, the Wade women donated 2 turkeys, 200 bowls of popcorn, 1 barrel Baldwin apple, 2,000 Kate Greenway handkerchiefs, 3 pairs of mittens, linen for doilies, wastebasket for office, 2,000 dolls, 2,000 mouth organs, 11,000 handkerchiefs, 1 book of character building, a box of Christmas card, another 2 pairs of mittens, 13 linen picture books, 9 bolts ribbon, and 1 drum, right? A very peculiar list. Miss Helen Wade, Ellen Wade's daughter, and I have to say that the Wade family is great in a lot of things, but they were not very creative in giving names. So there's a lot of Helen, Ellen, Homer, a lot of names being repeated across the generation, which makes the work of historians a bit challenging. But that's just a side note. But Ellen's daughter, who was only 12, was also participated in this Christmas given. She pitched in and gave 5 picture books, 2 dress dolls, 1 pair of bells, and 1 top. And all this idiosyncratic list of items shows how the Wade women, Ellen, Alice, Anna, and Helen, saw the asylum not only as a place where children should be well fed and well dressed, but also sought to educate them and provide them with a life and culture. The Wade women also made sure that the asylum orphans will have a great feast and that they will be warm and properly dressed for the Cleveland winter. They also wanted the children to experience music and art. When they donated food, clothes, and toys, they formed a personal connection with these children. These were not just money that you give and forget. They knew these children and they knew what they wanted. However, philanthropy and social betterment became more than just an expansion of the domestic sphere for the Wade women. For many Cleveland elite women like the Wades, social betterment and benevolence were a way to legitimate their presence in the public realm, seeing it as a fulfillment of their duty to society and their responsibility in managing city affairs. Concentrating on the field of education and social settlement work, these women activities enabled them to assert their power as charitable authorities and to consolidate a class identity that relied on their gender. It is important to note, however, that while charitable activities were done by moneyed women in Cleveland, this kind of philanthropic work was not limited only to the white women of Cleveland. African-American women, such as Jane Edna Hunter, who was the daughter of a sharecropper, was also very much involved in reform efforts and in promoting education. Hunter had worked her way into the middle class as a nurse and as a lawyer, and she wanted to provide safe housing and employment for working class Black women. She founded the Phyllis Whitley Association in 1911 under its first name, the Working Girls Association, which served as a settlement house for Black girls. The association provided lodging, job placement, and job training. And although it never had the resources that Goodridge House or Beechburg had, Hunter and the Phyllis Whitley Association also promoted the idea that philanthropy should include active community engagement and personal involvement, not only financial contributions. And while education and charity were important aspects of 19th century women philanthropy, other venues of social contribution enabled them to assert themselves not only as social benefactors of the poor, but also as refined women of taste, providing them with ways to shape their identities vis-a-vis their class peers. By venturing into new realms such as collecting and decorating, affluent women could situate themselves as an equal partners to their male counterparts, but without challenging the gender system too much. Often, moneyed women constructed philanthropic partnership with their husbands, donating and contributing to causes as one unit, each playing a certain gender role. Thus, for men, collecting became part of a social and business network that served as a means to claim social power. But for women, It was more of a personal endeavor that fitted their persona as benefactors and as fashionable elite, reflecting their growing importance as consumers, as well as their interest and expertise in taste, decoration, and style. Elite women collection of artifacts enable them to exert their cultural power and to use their status to break into new fields of philanthropy and to influence um, uh, ways that were often dominated by men. Collecting enable elite women to use consumption not only for expressing their own individual status, but also as a form of social betterment, turning the feminine display into an act of agency and power, in addition to pleasure. Ellen Wade, in particular, played an important role as her husband partner in promoting and enabling the founding of the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1916, one of the most maybe important cultural institutions in Cleveland. Like the orphan asylum, the museum was also a family project that sought to develop Cleveland as an influential and refined urban center. Jepta Omer Wade the first gave the land that surrounds the art museum that is now known as Wade Park as a gift to the city of Cleveland in 1882, designating a plot where the museum sits today for a theological institute. Yet it was his grandson, also bearing the same name but known as Omer, who was the living spirit behind the museum foundation, changing the purpose of the plot from a theological institute to an art gallery, and providing the seed money for the original endowment and for purchases. And to those of you who are familiar with the art museum knows that without the Wades, this museum would not be recognized as one of the highest institutions of art in the country. The amount that of items that the Wades contributed to the museum is really invaluable, and we cannot count them all almost. And really the collections would not have looked the way they are looked now without the Wades. Homer, who was trained by his father as a young boy to cultivate skills as a collector, together with his wife, donated to the museum close to 3,000 objects free from any restrictions that they purchased during their multiple trips around the world, and which served again as the bulk of the collection. Homer was also responsible for the fact that the museum is free for all the people forever. That was part of the mission and part of both of them, this belief that philanthropy needs to be without strings attached. And the idea behind founding the museum was not only to raise the city's reputation and prestige as urban center, but also for it to serve as an educational and cultural center for the city less affluent residents. And that's part of why the museum is free. As such, much attention was given to build up collections that will correspond with the interest of local industries and with the cooperation of Cleveland manufacturers. This naturally led to much involvement of men like Homer, who viewed his role in facilitating this relationship as mainly political. And it also relegated women's involvement in the museum to the margins, unfortunately, since unlike education and benevolent charity, which were associated with women's activity, fostering business relationship with the local community were much more associated with the men. Thus, while Homer played a central role in the museum administrative procedures and decision-making processes, taking official titles such as vice president and as a member of the executive committee, his wife, Ellen, like many women of her generation, remain at the margins of these efforts, never assuming an official role or professional role in the museum. In fact, apart from a few mentions of her as a donor, she's almost absent from the museum history. However, it would be wrong to minimize Helen's role in forming the museum's collection. Working together, Ellen and Omer engage in full and equal partnership of artifacts acquisitions and in shaping their vision for the institution. And this is only a few of the items that they collected. Well, oftentimes donations were done jointly, as you can see here, when Omer giving a proper credit to his wife. Even when contributions were done under the sole name of her husband, Ellen played a key role in the backstage of decision-making and in the buying process. Sometimes, however, contributions were done in Ellen's name alone. In 1915, Omer asked the museum director to register a collection of Tibetan jewelry as a donation of Mrs. Wade. Moreover, through her cultivation as a woman of refined taste, evident in her appearance and her home, Ellen was able to situate herself as a collector and as an art expert on her own right. And although Ellen was very much well-versed in high art, her main contribution as a collector, and as you can see here, were in their lace and jewelry collections, two fields that were heavily associated with refined womanhood in the 19th century. And indeed, much of the Wade contributions to the Cleveland Museum of Art are of decorative art, jewelry, and textiles, which they purchased on their joint travels. In 1916, Ellen gave the Cleveland Museum of Art her embroideries collection, collected over 18 years of her and her husband travels, and which was worth about $50,000, which is over $1 million in today's terms. Many of Ellen's jewelry, well, you see some of them of the example here, actually arrived to the Natural History Museum just across the street from the Museum of Art and were donated as part of Homer's gift to the museum in 1924. Although the main interest of the museum was in the gem value and not necessarily the design of the jewelry, many of the jewelry are still presented in a jewelry form. And for those of you who visited the museum, you know that the gallery is actually quite an interesting place among this very geological and sciencey locations. You can go and see somewhat more feminized gallery, seeing the Ellen's jewelry and a nice kind of like contrast to the Science Museum. Ellen's generosity and legacy of giving was not limited to her lifetime, but continued well after her death, which was a bit premature. And in fact, her contribution became even more known. Helen died in 1917 after a heart disease. And when she died, her husband established the Ellen Garretson Wade Fund with $1 million endowment to be given to charitable causes across Cleveland, ranging from hospitals, the orphan asylum, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and other relief work for children and working mothers. And it was a lot of money then, and it was certainly a lot of money now. The fund solidified Helen's position as a benefactor of children and women, and in the process also the image of the women philanthropist. Ellen's position as a collector was also maintained through philanthropy after her death. Her will bequeathed the art museum with her collection of her embroideries, antique vignettes, and small stuff boxes, and a collection of Oriental silver and gold jewelry. and the family continued to donate lace articles in Ellen's name to the Ellen G. Wade Memorial Lace Collection. Similarly, Flora Stonemathers' philanthropic legacy also intensified after her death. Her will bequests all the organization that she has given support through her to life, and among them, of course, not only Goodridge House, but Western Reserve University and the College for Women. Flora's husband, Samuel Mather, and her children honored Flora with a dormitory in her name in 1913, and that's where my office currently located, and built the Flora Stonemathers Memorial Building in 1914. In 1931, a board of trustees of the Western Reserve University renamed the entire college for women as the Flora Stonemathers College. And indeed, what characterized these philanthropic legacies, both of Ellen Wade and Flora Mather and other women of their time, was that they almost never took credit for their activities when they were alive. Yet if these women stayed in the shadow of the public eye during their lifetime and only received the appropriate credit for their philanthropy after their death, they should still be acknowledged for their role as public benefactors. These women helped to change the city's social and cultural landscape through their activities. In an age where the leisure class was still very much bounded by strict norms of gender and propriety, female philanthropy was not a form of self-interest or a way to advance a business agenda, but an extension of these women's motherly and feminine duties. By remaining true to their role as affluent women, they were able to expand the meaning of womanhood, providing it with greater public visibility and influence. The women philanthropists of Cleveland thus form a different way to engage with the community and benefit society that was very different from the one that their husband, their brothers, and their fathers did. They offered their time, attention, and ability to form personal relationships to advance causes for the common good. They used their clothing, their taste, and their inclination towards the art, not only to display wealth, but to carve new spaces of influence, even though these spaces often remained in the margins and never materialized into a profession. However, they did manage to fashion their own version of female philanthropy, harnessing their status as affluent women to create new public role and presence. As partners, rather than mere auxiliaries, these women redefine elite culture, providing new meanings not only to their own actions, but also to their role as active agents in the creating and the perpetuation of their class. And while these women today are mostly forgotten, their philanthropic legacy that they left us still very much alive and still very much with us today. So I hope that this short presentation kind of like gave them the right place in history that they deserve. And I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. That was great. I remember a few years back, there was that exhibit at the Cleveland History Center on the fashion of a lot of the philanthropic women of Cleveland. And I remember going thinking like, oh, that'll be nice to see some pretty dresses. That's all right. And it ended up being so brilliant because it was this microcosm of women, because all of these fancy dresses they had bought and worn to all of these philanthropic occasions. And so you guys they made it really into this exhibition about the power of female philanthropy in Cleveland. It was so interesting. Yeah. Okay, so we have lots of questions. There are a lot of people here. So I'm going to warn the audience right now, we probably won't be able to get to every single question, but we will forward them to Einav after the fact so that she'll be able to follow up with you if we can't actually get to your question tonight. So let's see. So can you talk about the relationship between Ellen Garretson Wade and Flora Stonemather? Were they friends? What was their interaction?
Sure. Yes, they were friends. As I said, the Cleveland elite was kind of like based on those familial and neighborhood connections and relationship. And not that they didn't go to the opera or to listen to the, to the orchestra and to do kind of like the big stuff. But their culture was much more based on kind of like family dinners and visiting, going to play dates with the kids. I mean, things that we're doing very much now were also done, the fact that they had a lot of money, they just did it, with cars, which, a lot of people did not have at the time. But they were really, because they didn't have that tradition of old money, they were normal people in many ways. So Helen and Flora, who were about the same age, were friends of each other. They knew each other. They went to Old Stone Church together. So there were a lot of those social circles that enabled those socializations. They oftentimes exchange photographs, which I guess was kind of like the 19th century version of Facebook, and writing messages and letters. And there's definitely those correspondence that exist both in Flora's paper and Ellen's paper. So they definitely had a connection. There was no kind of like cat fights among them.
Okay. And I got a question earlier in the evening too. What about interactions between these Cleveland families and families in Akron? Were there, like Perkins family and that sort of thing, were there interactions that far afield, or were the two cities relatively separate at that point?
There were some connection. Again, I mean, even Andrew Karangi, who was in Pittsburgh, was in connection. And we need to remember, Millionaires Row was a center for, the one of the kind of like richest people in the country. So it was part of this kind of like a broader relationship. There was also, we need to understand that many of these families often had summer homes or beach places and vacation homes in other places, not just in Cleveland. Some of them had as far as New York. So there was also connections with other elites, not just kind of like with more local, like Akron or Pittsburgh. But they had, they did talk with one another. They might not have, visited every afternoon. It's still the 19th century. Roads are not that great, but there simply are in connections with one another.
Nice. Another question from the audience. Are you aware of situations where the husband disagreed with his wife's charitable interests? And if so, were they fulfilled after her husband's death? Fantastic one.
Well, it is a fantastic question. I'm not aware. I mean, Homer himself was a very man of the arts. I mean, he had knowledge of its own, and I'm sure, like, if he wanted to buy something in their travels and Ellen was like, well, do we need to buy it? He's still kind of like, yes, we need to buy it. So there is still those issues, but I haven't came across of kind of like big fights about collections.
A question about the Goodridge House. Is it still standing? Where is it? What is it used for today?
That's a good question. I think that the building have been repurposed. I know that the Goodridge House itself moved. So even when it was active, it moved to a different building. So it didn't stay in that building anymore. I'm not sure that the building itself stands. But Goodridge House is still active, maybe not in the form of a settlement house, but the way that Beechburg is also very active today, not as an orphan asylum, of course, but also along those lines.
Yeah. I think she's referring to Flora Stonemathers' choices of charities eased by the fact that the wealth that she used was her own versus her husband's. Did that change her charitable outreach, do you think?
I think she was, she was much more independent in her decision. And for her, girls' education was really an important issue. She contributed not only to the women's college, but to Hathaway Brown, to other girls' schools in the city, partly because, for her, it was like, I want my daughters to go to a great school, and there was no great school, so she just funded one.
Yeah.
Because she had the money. And that was really a nice position, but she and Samuel Mather really had this very compassionate relationship, and they really did a lot of things together. Although I really think that the fact that she was at the end her kind of like the responsible to her family legacies. Her sister Clara married John Hay and moved to Washington, D.C. and kind of like became more active in the DC politics. So Flora was kind of like the Stone representative. And for her, I think that responsibility and sense that she needs to represent her family really influenced her decision to contribute to the Western Reserve. She was very influential in pulling the Stone Memorial, as well as the Delbert Hall, and all of these are very much kind of like, we see the Stone influence there.
Another question, where were the Wades from originally, and how and why did they end up in Cleveland?
As I said, Jephthah Homer was born in New York, in upstate New York, next to Seneca Falls. It was very modest, mean family. He worked as a painter as in early life, so he kind of like traveled around the country and ended up in Cleveland, again, partly because Cleveland was the center at the time. It was a huge city. I know that now it's kind of like being eclipsed by Detroit and by Chicago, but at the 19th century, Cleveland was a big center and was kind of like the place to be in a sense. And once he's getting involved in the telegraph industry, and the telegraph business, Cleveland is kind of like the place where capital, where businesses stand. So it is this logical place to end up in, just because of how the telegraph lines worked.
Okay. So just trying to read through.
Yeah, sure.
So you didn't mention the Rockefeller women so much in the presentation. Is that because they didn't contribute as much, or what was their philanthropic focus?
So Rockefeller, partly because of his oil industries, and that was kind of like he had a house here, and he actually was a good friend with the Wades. There's a beautiful letter that he wrote to Homer after Ellen's death. But he moved to New York very quickly and moved the entire family into New York, partly, and he wanted to become part of that elite. There was, because of the finance, again, sometimes you do it because, you really like someone and you want to be their friends, but there's a lot of economic interests that are involved here. And he knew that if he wanted to get finance and to get Standard Oil to what he wanted to be, he really had to form connections with the New York elite. So they had a home here. He grew up and he knew the families, but they weren't, their cultural presence was not as felt the way that the other families, socialized, partly because they weren't here, they were in New York.
Yeah, yeah. Did Helen and Flora coordinate their philanthropy in any way? Like deciding who was to do what?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
No.
it was each family at its own inclinations, and again, like family projects. It wasn't kind of like, this is my turf, don't touch it. I think that in the end, they all kind of like needed and knew each other and helped each other. But again, Goodridge was really, really a project of Flora Stonemathers. The way that the orphan asylum was kind of like a project of the Wade family. There were other involved in the Cleveland Museum of Art, but it was also kind of like a family project. The way that the Severance and the orchestra, for example, they are kind of like the family who took kind of like that area, right? So each family had its own inclinations and just did stuff and ended up having all those cultural institutions in Cleveland that we're enjoying until today.
I know, it's amazing. Speaking of all these things that we're still enjoying today, this is a nice little segue. What about women's suffrage? Were any of these women philanthropists involved in the suffragist movement?
So both Flora and Ellen, both of them died. Flora Stone, I think she died in 1906 or 1909. And Ellen died in 1917. Alice also died from a heart disease a year later. So they all died young, and they all died kind of like before suffrage really picked up nationally. Caroline Severance, actually, of all the moneyed women, was an early suffragist, and she was very involved in, and she was even one of the founders of the American Women Suffrage Association that was founded in Cleveland in 1869. And then she moved, but then she moved to Boston, and kind of like most of her suffrage activity was actually done in Massachusetts and in that area. But the Wade women, I mean, they weren't anti-suffrage, which, also, and Flora Stonemathers, as I said, was a very champion of girls' education. So they did have those women's rights agenda, but they were also very much women of their own period that were not rebels. They were not, go and marching in the street. That would be the next generation. So many of the big suffragists that Cleveland produced went to the women's college that Mather helped to found. So their legacies, while they themselves maybe have not became suffragists just because of the, the timing of their death and the timing of their lives, they were a model to other, to the generation that came after them of how to be active in the community. And so their legacy in a way, that way may be connected to the suffrage.
Paved the way. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions about how you fell into this particular path of research and how you became inspired to study this.
So it was a postdoc that the Western Reserve Historical Society offered, and I was very happy to get it. I thought that my project, I was like, let's look at the women of the family and let's look at the role of women in Gilded Age Cleveland and thinking about their social and cultural contributions. And I was very happy. I mean, the Western Reserve Historical Society is a wealth of of archives and information about this period. And I was very fortunate to have, been able to have access to all those papers and documents that really helped me to take these women and really to shed lights on them. Because I think we often think about these powerful families, and we often forget that, behind every man stands a, whatever the cliche says. But I think, and especially in 2020, we need to give the spotlight also to the women.
Of course, yeah, yeah. Let's see, do you have time for another couple of questions? Okay. What church did the Wades belong to? And yeah, that was the question, sorry.
That's an interesting question. Jepta Wade was very into Christian Science. And so they were really into that. So they really, and it's important to remember that Old Stones Church was a church, and people went there to get their spiritual, traditions, but it was also kind of like a community gathering. So you would go to the church not necessarily because you were a Presbyterian or because you were part of that religion, but they weren't really because they're kind of like affiliation with the Christian Science and all kind of other quacky ideas, I guess, about religion at the time. Alice Wade was really into water cures. They weren't really affiliated with an institutional church in Cleveland, the way that the Mathers were.
Somebody's asking if you can recommend a book about Cleveland's past that focuses especially on the philanthropic projects that improved the city, whether male or female.
Oh, wow. There's Jen Singliano book that look at the Euclid Avenue families and mention. It's not really about philanthropy, but it really gives you the background of kind of like the history of that millionaire row. And actually, there is a novel that was written at the time that was kind of like a satire, but it was referring to Euclid Avenue. So if you, I'm now blanking on the name, I can, come up with this. I think it's something with the breadwinners. But it was kind of like a more contemporary depiction of that elite that is, it's a good read.
Yeah. One more, is that?
Sure.
Okay. We have all of this philanthropic work that these families are doing. What was the role of the government in providing social services during this era, the Gilded Age?
So there's not really a government in this period, and we need to remember that the Gilded Age is a period of private business. It will only, in the progressive era, which is more kind of like towards the 20th century, that reformers will look at the government as a tool to really circumvent and regulate big business, because big business would become problematic. But it was only after the Great Depression and FDR and the New Deal that really the government took a role in what we now call, charity or more philanthropic issues like education, like healthcare, what the settlement houses were doing, looking at public policies, public health, those issues. It will only be after the Depression, where when people see, you know what, private money is not enough.
It's not enough.
We need the government to step in, because only, only the government can deal with crisis that is that big.
Yeah, yeah. Well, great. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. So informative and lots of questions and lots of interaction. That this has been just really lovely. Thank you so much, Einav.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to
everybody.
everybody. Yeah, to being here. I will say, just to plug, our next in this series is going to be in February, and in celebration of Black History Month. That lecture is going to be on Charles Waddell Chestnut, and it's called the Charles Waddell Chestnut, The Civic Life of a Cleveland Creative. And it's going to be by Virginia Williams, who is a historian at the Western Reserve Historical Society. So look out for more information for that. And thanks to Einav, thanks to the League of Women Voters, thanks to the Cleveland History Center, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. All right. Good night.
Okay, that's it.
Yep. Good night, everybody.
Good night.